Get dressed right here. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you again. We're in Micah. We've been in Micah for 4 weeks now, I think. And so if you'd like to look at Micah 4 and 5, that's where we'll be today. There is no 3 weeks, is that right, until Easter? How about to say there's about a month until Easter. And Micah will get us to Easter, and what's after that, I don't know yet. We'll all be surprised together. It will be delightful. I don't know what it's going to be. It's going to be good, whatever it is. This little kind of jaunt back into the prophets, after having spent a lot of time in Mark and a lot of time in Exodus, both of those were fairly long studies. This is a change of pace, not only because it's brief, about 6 weeks or so to get us to Easter. It's also a change of gears in a sense because it's a different kind of literature than what we looked at when we read a gospel. It's a different kind of book than when we looked at Exodus. We looked at a long narrative with some law. So prophecy. The basic unit of thought for prophecy is the oracle. So here is the prophet is the mouthpiece from the divine to the people, to mediate a message or to convey a message, to make an announcement. Now, the content of that announcement could be wonderful news, a welcome announcement, good news, a relief, a word of hope, a word of restoration. Excuse me. It's fine as long as I don't breathe. And it's better than it has been for 6 weeks. Don't want to get off on a coughing jag in the middle of class. A welcome relief, hope, a future, restoration, renewal. Okay? That announcement or that message could be doom. It could be judgment. It could be your days are numbered. I see what's going on and it won't last forever. So the prophet could convey some good news. The prophet could convey some bad news. But the prophet delivers the message. Okay, so when we read a prophet, like Micah, kind of the unit of thought that we're looking for is the oracle. That is the kind of the self-contained unit of thought that is what the prophet conveys to the people. When we were reading 1 Timothy, or when we were reading a letter, pick one, anyone, Romans, Corinthians, we were in 1 Timothy for a while. Kind of the rhetorical art of the letter is we want to persuade and inform, and there's an argument that's being laid out. The rhetorical form of narrative is to lay out an unfolding story. So there's characters, and there's scene, and there's dialogue, and there's a plot that advances, and usually the plot is driven by some type of conflict, or we're going to a place, or we need to resolve something. The narrative has its own kind of conventions of how it works. The prophet Micah looks like contains 3 oracles. If you look at 1 verse 2, oh, thank you. Just in case. Thank you. 1 verse 2, now listen. And if you look at 3 verse 1, now listen. And look at 6 verse 1. Now listen. Okay? Listen, listen, listen. That phrase, repeated 3 times, marks off the beginning of a pair of a new oracle, and each oracle set, for lack of a better term, has a pair of things. The message is hope and doom. Each of these 3 oracles has a what we would say a good news, bad news kind of situation. It's going to lead with doom. I guess I should say bad news, good news. It's going to lead with doom and followed by an oracle of hope in each case. Some of these are longer and shorter. For example, in the first couplet, or the first set, or the first pair, chapter 1, verse 2 to about 2 verse 11 or so. Okay, you can see our Pew Bible kind of marks these paragraphs off. Okay, that is a fairly long, in our Pew Bible it's a page and a half. That's a fairly long oracle of doom, followed by the end of 2, verse 11 and 12 and 13, just two verses, short paragraph. That's a very brief oracle of hope. Now, chapter 3, verse 1 begins the second pair. 3 verses 1 through 12 are basically what we would call chapter 3, is a brief oracle of doom. And we looked at that last week. On the heels of that, chapters 4 and 5 is an extensive oracle of hope. That's what we'll look at today. So if you want to read ahead for next week, we're going to begin the third and final couplet, or the third and final pair, or the third and final oracle in this book, which begins at chapter 6, verse 1. Now listen, and goes through, in this case, 7 verse 6, 7 verse 7. You see that paragraph again. Our Pew Bible breaks the paragraph up at 7:7. Okay, that is an extensive, again, by comparison, relatively speaking, that's a long section of doom. And the book ends with what we would call 7 verse 8 through verse 20, with a brief word of hope at the end. Okay? So each of these oracles contains a pair, doom and hope, doom and hope. So the prophet announces, the prophet brings a word to the people from the deity, hear the word of the Lord. Okay? So that's what, for example, if you remember your Greek mythology, there was an oracle. And so the Greeks would go seek this, and it was an actual building and an installation. It's kind of like they had a staff. Okay? And they're seeking something from beyond. Okay? So in the life of the Jews, in the period that we're talking about, so we're about 300 years after David, King David, the great King David, the kingdom has divided and things are not going well. There's a lot of political instability, one within the former tribes have kind of split amongst themselves into 2 kingdoms. I won't rehash all of that, but if you look at Micah 1:1, you see there's 2 or 3 kings mentioned. And if we were to go to the book of Kings, which is about really the only place to go to see these, the narrative that kind of envelops the prophet Micah, we'd see there's a lot of instability within the kingdom. and there's a lot of instability kind of on the world stage. I guess what we would say, the geopolitical situation in 8th century BC, Palestine, Israel, kind of draw a line from Asia Minor down into Egypt, and you go right through Israel. The situation is fluid, and it's always been that way, and it's fairly tense and hostile. And Israel caught in the middle, Judah caught in the middle. And so what will happen is the northern neighbors, Syria or Assyria, and the southern neighbors, Egypt, everyone's interested in that land bridge that joins Asia Minor and Africa, where Israel and Judah are. They are in the land bridge. And so trade, communication, money, power, all the things that make people want to fight, to claim things. Bless you. All that hangs in the balance with who controls the little land strip. Okay? Well, if Israel and Judah are already divided, that's not good. And if they are susceptible to the great powers of Assyria, it's not good. Within that's the kind of political context, within the religious, obviously we're dealing with a group of people, and this is there's a religious aspect to this, not a secular, governmental, secular, political discussion. It's a religious thing, okay? This people have not honored the law as given by Yahweh when he brings them out of Egypt. And that will be a function of the prophets to indict the people, to say, this is not, the way things are going is not how we intended them to go when we brought you out of Egypt, and the promise to Abram to build a people and to establish the people in this land. This is not going the way that we intended it to go. So again, you think prophetic, and you think that kind of, shaking the finger, wagging the finger, the prophetic tradition of indictment that comes along in this oracle of doom. For example, last week in chapter 3, some of the indictments. There is no justice. You leaders of the people, you mistreat the people. And the image is you eat them up. You strip their flesh from their bones like a butcher would carve up an animal at the butcher shop and get it ready for a stew or a soup. That is no way to treat the people. Again, this is not a purely political statement for Israel and Judah. This is the leaders here are also the religious leaders of the people. Okay, so it's hard not to read this kind of through the lens of our American democracy, but we're kind of dealing with a different kind of entity when we look at the nation of Israel in the time of the prophet Micah. So the rulers of the house of Israel are not only the civic leaders, not talking about the mayor and the alderman only, for lack of a better term. We're talking about priests. We're talking about Levites. We're talking about the religious leaders of the people. Okay. Look at verse 3, verse 7. The seers. The people who are supposed to have insight. The time is coming. It's going to be dark for you. You're not going to see. The irony is the prophets, the people who should have insight. Nope. Verse 3, verse 9, you rulers of the house of Israel who abhor justice and pervert everything that is right. You build Zion as a theologically loaded name. Zion is the city, God's great city in Jerusalem, the hill in Jerusalem, the temple on Mount Zion. You build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with injustice. Her leaders issue rulings for a bribe. So there's that indictment, the doom. The rulers would be the leaders. The rulers would be the civic leaders, also the religious leaders. The judgments would be similar to what we would go back and look at the book of Judges, when the leaders would adjudicate, yes, civil affairs, but also all of the religious affairs that we could read if we were to go back through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So the religious life of the people, it kind of is up for bids to the highest bidder. And if you can bribe the leaders, you can get your way. That's not the way God intended his people to live. So that indictment. All right. Well, let's look at chapter 4 and 5 and see an oracle of hope. It's been all gloom and doom so far. Well, another function of the prophet is to reassure the people. We know it's bad. And God knows it's bad. And the judgment is deserved. Israel in covenant with Yahweh, again, I mentioned this last week, the prophets presuppose the covenant. We talked about that already with Exodus at length. We talked about that. Here the prophets come in and say, you have not honored the covenant. For hundreds of years we've lived in covenantal relationship. The people of God and Yahweh, and the law gives us the kind of the content of what that relationship ought to look like. It rests on who God is and what he has done in creation and in bringing Israel out of Egypt to be a people, Abram's children for the sake of the world. So if you want to kind of get a handle on the presuppositions of the prophets, we want the people of God in the land of God in covenant with God for the purposes of God. The people in the land in covenant for the purpose of God, which is ultimately the blessing of all of humanity. Israel is one nation for the sake of all nations. Again, I feel like a broken record. It's kind of the same thing every week, but it needs to be said every time to remind us why these doom oracles have some teeth and why the hope is so hopeful. Okay? The great grief of the prophets is that we do not honor the covenant. And the great hope of the prophets is your success and your blessing does not rest on your performance of the covenant. In other words, if we're going to pull this thing out, it's not up to you alone. The great, gracious message of the prophets sometimes gets overlooked when we think prophets are the kind of the finger waggers and they're just shaming and, you remember Gomer? For shame, for shame, for shame. Remember that? You think you can caricature the prophet like that, but it would be a caricature. The doom is accurate, the judgment is accurate, it's here, but there is hope. And so one of the great hope of the prophet is this was never going to be a success because it was up to you. Creation was not up to you, and your liberation out of Egypt was not up to you. You were not a great people. You were not strong. I brought you out of Egypt because I loved you, because I obligated myself to you in covenant with you, and I decided for the sake of all people to bless you for their good, for your good and for their good. So the people in the land in the covenant for the purposes it all rests on God's gracious initiative. And the prophets come along and say, don't forget that. I know it's bad. I've just told you how bad it is. Trust me, I know. But let me also tell you how good it can be. Okay? Verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. This poetry is it will get to you. Just as the doom, kind of puts the finger in your chest and points back at you, the hope is genuinely hopeful. And many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. This has been the intent ever since Abram, way back in Genesis 11 and 12. As I see this phrase here, the nations will say, so again, here we are. Micah says, I see a day coming, and you need to hear that I know a day is coming. You need to know the day is coming when the mountain, we had just talked about, 2 verses up, 3 verses up, how the mountain of Zion is built with bloodshed. I see a day coming when the mountain will be higher, than all. The Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains, above all the other hills. Something you can see, something that has strength and vitality. Right now, it's kind of rotten, but I see something vigorous and strong, and I see that the nations, it's like the nations say to each other, let's go up. That's been the whole point since the beginning of this story in Genesis, is against the backdrop of Genesis 11 with all of the nations, Yahweh chooses Abram to bless for the sake of all of the nations. So what we have here in this vision for the future really in some ways is a reach back to bring what we've always wanted to do back to the forefront. So the purposes of God will not be thwarted. And I know it seems like it's awful now, here in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. We go read in 2 Kings about that. The geopolitical situation in Israel in the 8th century BC is not at all good. And you could be pardoned if you kind of look around and you could say, this whole thing is absolutely hopeless. The Assyrians are breathing down our neck, and our king, who, by the way, and kind of all of the administration, we would say, the whole lot of them will sell us out to the highest bidder. You can't trust them any further than you can throw them. I don't know what the Hebrew word for that is, but you can't trust them any further than you can throw them. They are supposed to be our leaders. And it looks like they're making treaties with Assyria, which they did. And if that's the case, it's over for us. I don't see any way out. And indeed, there was no way out, because the kings had gradually inched their way into treaties with these nations to where they were then beholden to them. Which is why, again, if we were to go back to Exodus or to Deuteronomy, Yahweh says, do not make treaties with these nations. Your security in the land that I promise you is because I will make you secure, not because you will gain security through a political alliance. They will also turn your hearts. The sorcerers, the divination, the fortune tellers, the religious kind of milieu of the nations around you will turn your heart. And if you look at some of the kings mentioned in Micah 1:1, that's exactly what they do. One of them offers up a child in sacrifice. It's truly horrid. This is not a not an honest disagreement about a religious practice. I mean, it gets to the root of some very, very different ways of living and being in the world compared to what Yahweh envisions for Israel for the sake of the world. Do not go there, what we would say. Well, they went there. And I don't know that, well, will there ever be a way out? You look around on the 8th century kind of landscape, the stage, you say, I don't know there's ever going to be a way out. And indeed, there wasn't. Assyria comes in and sieges Jerusalem and Samaria. Well, Samaria first, and capital of Israel. And then Judah is overthrown by Babylon. So first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, they siege the city, they take the king, the client, the great king of Israel becomes a client king, a little vassal to the powerful Assyrians. There is no agency, there is no political integrity to the nation anymore. It's gone. And the people are just physically taken away to Assyria and swept clean, and the greatness of Israel is gone. Poof, gone. And the Babylonians will do the same for Judah 120 years later, 130 years later, or 140 years later. 722, when Israel falls to Assyria, and about 586 BC, when Babylon comes and Judah falls to Babylon. So if you were to look around and you would say, right now it looks hopeless, you'd be right, because it was. But the prophet says, I can see beyond the Assyrian domination in the short term, and I can see a long term. Okay, and in the long term, the house of Zion, the purposes of God that he announced from the beginning are not at all in jeopardy. You need to hear that, because what you will see, you will live and die, and your children and your grandchildren in Assyrian or Babylonian captivity. You will not see it. Your children won't see it. Your grandchildren won't see it. I'm here to tell you it's bad, and it'll be bad for a couple hundred years, maybe 300 or 400 years. There'll be generations where you will think, this is over, capital O, over. And I'm here to tell you, it's not the least bit over, because I can see beyond. And so the oracle, the revelation to the people, you need to know this is not over. In your time frame, you think it is, and it looks that way because right now where you sit, it is, in a sense. But what I can see that you can't is that the purposes of God long term are by no means done. Okay? Verse 3. We're not going to go verse by verse all the way through chapter 5. Okay. I do have one eye on the clock. Okay. Got 4 minutes. Okay. He will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. Here's this great phrase. Couldn't not bring this out in class. They will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Have you heard that? That's a famous verse. Comes out of Micah 4. Nation will not take up the sword against nation, for they will never again train for war. I see a day when each person will sit under his grapevine and under his fig tree with no one to frighten him. All right? We have a fig bush in our backyard. It's an overgrown mess. Did not get to that this week. Did a lot of other things, but hadn't got to the figs. Okay? It will. Last year they were as small as your thumb and about as hard as a golf ball. But they will make figs. Okay? So I can go out in the backyard and I can set it under my fig tree and no one's going to bother me. Isn't that nice? You're going to sit under your fig tree and everything's going to be okay. Not to be trite, everything's going to be okay. The swords into plows and spears into pruning knives, you take your fighting implements back to the forge and you reforge them into cultivation tools. In a sense, it is a return to the very beginning when Yahweh instructs the humans, tend to the Garden of Eden. So humanity, in a sense, things will be the way that they should have always been. From the beginning, when we tend the garden, we stopped tending the garden and we started killing each other. You remember the beginning of Genesis, Cain and Abel. We stopped tending the garden and we started killing each other. And Micah says, I see a day coming when we will so alter our war-making tools that we can't go back to war anymore. We're not going to know war anymore. Right? There's a song in there somewhere, right? We will instead fulfill our intended purpose. The nations, all of the nations, will come together to the hill of Zion, and the nations will have their disputes arbitrated, and the nations will beat their war-making implements into agricultural tools and real, again, to use language, we're going to retool all the factories. Okay, the bomb-making factories, we're now making, we're in Texas, combines? What do you do out here? What is it out here that you need to make the land produce a wonderful thing? Okay? On the hills in East Tennessee, we'd have a one-horse plow is what we would have. Okay? My great-grandfather, they talk about this, but talk about standing up in West Virginia and reaching out and tilling the corn because the hillside was so steep. That's about what it was. He didn't know a thing about farming in any type of scale other than a one-horse plow, and bought a farm and then tried to farm in the 1930s to how he knew how to farm in West Virginia in the 1870s with this totally kind of backwards way to do things. Okay, you're stumbling through, and you're fighting and you're killing each other. All those days are going to be over. And we will again return to our purpose. So think about all of the great purposes that God has intended for his people. They are now a reality. Time's going to run right out on us. Look at verse 6. I'll get the lame and the scattered. We're going to turn them into a remnant. We're going to remake them. Your strength in the future does not rest upon your capacities at the moment. So says Yahweh, God of Israel. I will make you into a great people because of what I will do, not because you're strong. So the message of grace from the prophets is very, very strong and very, very vivid. You just keep going. Turn the page. Go on down chapter 5. Chapter 5, 4 and 5. Talking about the great king that's going to come out of Bethlehem. This gets taken up in the Gospels when we talk about Jesus. He will be their peace. 5 verse 5. Paul takes this up in Ephesians when he talks about what God has done to bring Jew and Gentile together in the church. He is our peace. It comes right out of the prophet Micah. What God is doing in the church is the fulfillment of Micah's hope for the restoration of all things. We are right now enjoying some of the long-anticipated hope that Micah looked forward to. That's great news. We're in the middle of this hopeful oracle that Micah envisioned. I wanted to get to that point to stop. That's a great note on which to stop. It's also time to stop. I owe you 2 minutes.
The swords to
Yes.
the plowshare.